Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to do this workshop with you all today. And this is a part of the DeKalb campaign, a series of workshops that will be related to understanding reproductive justice, our bodies, and really just getting a sense of what this movement is about. I am Sabrine Mohammed's colleague, Navila Rashid, she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Maryland. And I also work for HEART, which I will get into a little bit later. The series for today is going to be on consent and our RIDHA framework. Anything that I talk about today in this workshop is not the views of the Department of Justice. We are one of their grantees, part of their technical assistance grants, and so I just need to give you all this disclaimer. So HEART is a national nonprofit. We are based kind of all over the nation. HEART is an acronym that stands for Health Education, Advocacy, Research, and Training. These are also our 4 programming arms. So with health education, this is really Sabrine's bread and butter, where we're thinking about, well, what does it look like for our communities to have the language and access to tools and resources? So we have a virtual resource center. We're producing a lot of publications. We just released a sex talk book, and we partner with local organizations with campus programs to really just give workshops and raise awareness. Our advocacy programming arm is 2-tiered. We do micro advocacy and macro advocacy. With micro, we're really looking at case management and doing the one-on-one survivor support. This is done through our Survivor Care Fund, our Reproductive Justice Care Fund, and also through a referral network, really connecting survivors to financial assistance or getting them connected to other services. Our macro advocacy is more looking at the systems. And so what does oppression and harm look like on a policy level? So really doing the policy work and thinking about our communities and the work of reproductive violence and gender-based violence in that intersection. Research is pretty self-explanatory in that we're working with academic institutions to really work on different surveys and different papers, essentially to gather information and data on what is it that we need to know about Muslim survivors, specifically around, again, reproductive health or gender-based violence. And then training is most of where our professional development occurs with mainstream providers and community leaders. We're doing technical assistance trainings, we're doing professional development, and really, again, working with professionals, whether they are working in this field or not, to have the language to speak towards and alongside any of their clients or constituents that may be the most impacted Muslims, specifically within the reproductive health or gender-based violence realm. Our mission is to promote sexual health, uproot gendered violence, and advance reproductive justice by establishing choice and access for the most impacted Muslims. And our vision is not simple, it's pretty lofty, but it's definitely a very important vision, is a world where all Muslims are safe and exercise self-determination over their reproductive lives and communities they live, work, and pray in. And here's a set of our values. I'll go through them pretty quickly, but this is essential to understanding the work that we do, both internally and externally. We are faith-driven, so we're really trying to uplift these particular Islamic values, which is compassion, justice, accountability, and gratitude. This is what really drives us and the work that we do. And something you may pick up on is that these core Islamic values are also what ends up becoming a lot of the frameworks that we've developed to understand healthy relationships, to understand how to respond to folks that have experienced violence, to understand what does accountability look like through institutions. Empathy, this is a value that really has us think about, well, what are non-judgmental ways to support individuals to heal, live, and authentically reclaim their stories. If we're not empathetic, we're not cultivating a space of compassion, and this work cannot be done if we aren't able to be empathetic. Belonging, this is a very important one. This is essentially our space to say, well, we have to be inclusive because all races, sexual orientation, gender identities, economic backgrounds, abilities, and religious practices should feel welcome, seen, and heard. Many times this can cause a lot of tension when there isn't a sense of belonging. And we strive at HEART to cultivate those spaces because we know that if folks have a sense of belonging, it allows them to speak to their stories, to speak to their truths. Speaking of which, our next one is compassionate truth truth-telling, which is our way of saying we need to challenge harmful narratives as a way to achieve equity and freedom. If we're not able to confront a lot of the misunderstandings or stereotypes or just harmful information that's out there, it then silences folks from being able to, again, share their stories and their authenticity to be able to feel empowered and grounded. And then our last value is humility. We know that we're experts in some ways because it's our profession to do this work. We've done a lot of, learnings around this. However, you all are also experts, and it's really integral to us that we work alongside everyone and understand that it's their cultural realities that really help us do this work. We do this work together. We learn so much more when we aren't doing work at people and more so doing work alongside people. And so that's really, really a list of our values and how we do this work. So today we're going to go over three major things: understanding consent through three perspectives. And the three perspectives are through the lens of gender-based violence, looking at consent as a personal skill, and thinking about it as a community culture. Our second objective today is the concept of RIDHA and how to use this to identify what is a healthy relationship and what's safe and what's unsafe. And then there will be some activities to understand consent in RIDHA. Since we're recording, the activities are going to be more so of me just sharing some case scenarios. And so this will be pretty brief, or I'll try. So let's dive into consent in relationships. So I want you all to start off with two questions, or a handful of questions. And as I go through today's session, think about these questions and what are coming up for you. So the first one is, what are some ways that messaging about consent can be conflicting? And what messages do you get from the media about consent, or your peers, or your faith? We're asking these questions as a way for us to start to think about, have we truly gotten a sense of consent? Do we understand it? Or what is it about consent that has us still confused, if that's even something that we're thinking about? Now, before I dive into consent and the intricacies or more details about it, it's really important for us to kind of step back and look at it from a macro perspective. And by macro, I mean, let's look at systems. We know consent on the most basic level is telling or asking someone if they are saying yes or no to something. But if we're thinking about consent in a way that's a little bit more conspicuous, we can see that consent is going to show up in different ways when it's structural, which we see down here, institutional, or even interpersonal. So we know very well the interpersonal aspects. And so some other ways that we can see this in an interpersonal way that's more related to systems is surveillance and mental health, and surveillance and sexual health. For institutional, what we can see is, for example, the funding for extreme forms of gender-based violence. So this can look like honor killings versus what we typically know to be as intimate partner violence. Another is sex-selective abortion regulation. We see a lot of this happening throughout this country, and not just from the fall of Roe v. Wade, but also just from the conception of this country. We also see overpopulation discourse for eugenics. And then also again, another conspicuous way we can see it on an institutional level is sharing client information with third-party providers. Again, without the client's consent, or you're signing a consent form. And oftentimes when I sign one related to this, I should, but I'm not always reading the fine print. And when we're not, we're essentially giving away our rights to our information. So that is also, a violation of consent or a manipulation of consent. On a structural level, which we see here on the yellow, we see things like medical experimentation of gendered Muslim, Black, and brown bodies, forced sterilizations, rape as a war tactic against Muslim populations, and not just specifically Muslim populations, but we can see this really being used in any type of war against any type of people. But since we're Heart, and since we do this work for the most impacted Muslims, a lot of what I'm talking about today will have that Muslim context to it. We also see structural level of mental health and surveillance as well. And this can be seen as, for example, we can see mandated reporting here. So if you are a therapist, essentially being a mandated reporter is very much likened to working as law enforcement or a part of law enforcement. The surveillance and documentation, what are therapists actually documenting during sessions that may or may not be subpoenaed? So again, a violation of client rights and information. And then the last one here we have is inaccurate sexual health education. And we know this one to be true across the board. I know growing up, I did not have good sexual health education. In fact, I'm Muslim and South Asian. My parents opted me out of it because they had this fear that if I learn about sexual health, then I may have sex, which we know to be untrue. So let's dive into the perspectives of consent. So I kind of gave you a snippet of consent in relationship to violence, but like more on a systems level. Throughout this training workshop, this series, this session, you'll see me alluding to violence or gender-based violence and what happens with consent. So you'll kind of see that first one interlaced. The second one is diving into consent as a personal skill. So I'll actually go through what does it look like to get consent and understanding that process so that we acknowledge that consent is not just something we need in a sexual relationship or a sexual scenario, but rather it is actually a personal skill that we need to build from birth to till we pass. And the third one is, in order for us to understand consent, the larger picture is a cultural shift. What does it mean for us as a community to embody consent so that we can talk about it more freely, to talk about it in a way that makes more sense so that it's more accessible? Here is an image that I love. It's the consent iceberg. And this one, I wanted us to start off with this is because there's so many different ways that we can think about consent or talk about consent. And oftentimes the iceberg is, or this depiction of the iceberg is to say that when we see the iceberg, that's not all it is. Underneath, the iceberg is being anchored by more ice. So with this consent iceberg, what we're showing is that on top, we're seeing the surface level understanding of consent. We're thinking of it as permission. We're thinking of it as possibly contracts. We're thinking of it as no means no. I'm not saying this isn't consent. Those things aren't consent. I'm saying yes. And let's go deeper. Consent can also be thinking about body language, thinking about the emotional attunement. How are folks connecting with one another? I highly believe in energies. And if, for example, I'm asking my sister something and she's saying yes, but her body language and her emotional energy is off, then I know that that's actually not a yes. So we need to think a little bit deeper and more nuanced when it comes to consent. Some other things that's related to consent that we don't necessarily talk about or even consider when having those conversations is it's also an agreement between people. We see contracts up above, but below, agreements between people and different types of people. We want to consider things like gaze or breath, facial expressions. Consent is also in other ways content warning. So when we're writing posts or writing emails or about to share a story, we want to always give content warnings or trigger warnings. That's also a form of consent. We want to prepare the nervous system. Sometimes we might get activated, or sometimes we might get anxious. We might get excited. And so that's all a part of consent as well. We also really want to consider power dynamics. This is going to come into play in terms of who is giving consent, who is asking for consent, who's receiving consent, all the things. But power dynamics are very important. We want to think about capacity, limitations, and resources, and also eliminating surprises and managing expectations. So there's a lot to consent than just permission, getting permission, contracts, and no means no. So here I've got some more information on consent. It's explicit in verbal and nonverbal communication. It lies on a spectrum. It's always evolving, and we have the ability to give it and retract it at any time. It's across one's lifespan. I'll go into that a little bit later. And it's needed regardless of the relationship. So even if, let's say, you're married, you still need consent within that marriage for whatever it is that you want to do, whether it's sexual or not. You still need consent. And also, consent is the autonomy over one's own body. We really need to start thinking about consent as something to be safe. Oftentimes, someone can and will say yes as a result of being scared, or they may have trauma from someone else, and the yes is more of a survival yes. Make sure that if you are the person asking for consent, because you are the one doing it for someone, that you are asking them and reassuring them that they don't have to do anything with you if they are not comfortable. So again, each new action needs a check-in. So again, I'm saying the action does not have to be sexual whatsoever. The action can be anything, like thinking about, hey, do we want to go to a party? Do we want to engage in some particular event? Do we want to take on a project? Things like that. Saying yes to one form of touch, for example, does not signify yes to another form of touch or intimacy. So that's an example of checking in for every new action. And yes, that one was more of like a physical one. When someone says no, it's considered violent and abusive if you coerce them, ignore them, and continue, or guilt them, or punish them. I'll get into that a little bit later as well, but these are some things to consider when it comes to consent. When I talked about consent across the lifespan, what I mean is consent needs to apply from infancy to adolescence to adulthood to elder age. So if you are an infant, for example, infants cannot give consent to any sexual touch. Again, a violation of their bodily autonomy, and they just legally also cannot do that. If you're an adolescent or an adult or an elder, again, same thing applies. I know I gave a scenario of sexual violence, for example, but again, it could be related to anything that's not sexual. Which goes to my second point. Consent is not just about anything related to sex and intimacy, but it can also be on non-sexual touch. An example is asking a child if you can hug them goodbye. I know growing up in my culture, it was customary for me to hug and kiss goodbye my grandparents or my aunts and uncles. But many times as a child, I just didn't want to. And so it's, again, if we think about culture, we need to think about consent culture and how maybe some of these practices are basically a violation in some ways if we think about it. If children can give consent, or it's important for them to experience consent, if they say no to a hug, we as adults shouldn't take it personally and really think about, well, they have a right to say no. So what are we teaching them? And the last one is it can be revoked at any point at someone's lifespan. So for example, as a child, I might consent and say yes to one thing. When I'm an adult, I might say no to that same thing and I revoke it. So that's what we mean by lifespan. And that's what we mean by you can give it or you can revoke it. You can also revoke it in one given instance. So I might give consent and say yes to one thing right now in this given moment. And maybe 5 to 10 minutes later, I might say, actually, no, I don't, I revoke it. That is also okay. It's not, consent isn't like a one-time, hey, I gave you consent, yes, and like, that's it. So consent is much more dynamic than that. Again, more information on consent, what consent is and what I want to talk about more specifically is, again, it's informed, it's specific, it's conscious, it's voluntary without force and coercion or intimidation. That's important because if we do experience force, coercion, or intimidation, there is no consent and we're experiencing violence and harm. Also, consent is ongoing throughout sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. It's also not just agreeing to a particular sexual activity, but also can include boundaries that you set within activities. So using contraception or kissing, but no sex, or I don't want to use contraception, things of that nature. And also, consent is something to be obtained from your current partner if you wish to enter a relationship with someone else who is not your current partner. So I do want to stress that monogamous relationships aren't the only type of relationships. We also have polyamorous relationships. We have open relationships. There's just a diversity of types of relationships. But either way, when you are in any of those, we want to make sure that we're obtaining consent from our current primary partner. We don't want to surprise someone. We don't want to have secret relationships because, again, secrets or hiding can cause harm, especially if the other person is going to find out. Again, consent is more than a yes and more than a no. So in that iceberg slide, I said no means no. That's oftentimes what we're seeing on top of the iceberg, the superficial understanding of consent. And so this slide is really going into all the different ways that people can say yes and all the different ways people can say no. So for example, moaning, complete silence, and hesitation. Those are three things that are either vocal in some way or not. And those three things, if you look at it in any different way, can mean yes or can mean no. In the green thought bubbles or speech bubbles, you'll see terms like, is this okay? That's feeling amazing. Keep going. Or can I touch you here? Those are more of like a different way of saying yes. In the red speech bubbles, we're hearing things like, this doesn't feel right. I don't know if we should. Ouch. Whoa, can we slow down? Again, it's not explicitly saying no. So it's really important for us to, again, think about verbal tonation, our facial expressions, our body language, the ways in which we actually know one another, to be able to kind of decipher, oh, someone's uncomfortable, or, oh, like this person really wants something, but they're just not saying it. Let's have a conversation. Let's try to seek out consent and see if someone's going to be okay with something. Now, let me go specifically into what consent is not. Consent is not given in person, but through email, text, or social media. It cannot be given when one person is incapacitated under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Also, you can't give consent if you're asleep, unconscious, or going in and out of consciousness. Also, think about what state you live in, but depending on the state you live in, a person that is considered a minor, under 17 in most states, and the other person is adult, consent does not exist legally. If anything sexual does happen, that would be considered statutory rape, and that is considered a crime. Consent can also not be given when one person is in a position of authority over the other person. So, for example, doctor and patient, clergy members, teachers and students, caregivers and the people that they're caregiving. Parent and child is another form of that. Even amongst colleagues, this one can get a little bit more nuanced, but if you're colleagues of the same position, if you think about intersectionality and your identities, it could be that one person has more power because of their race, because of their socioeconomic background, because of their access to certain resources at a particular institution, because of their gender, because of their gender identity and gender expression. So there's a lot of things that can even give you a little bit more power than someone else, even if you work in the same position or in the same hierarchy. And the last one is you cannot give consent if the person has severe physical, developmental, or mental disability that inhibits their ability to understand and thereby give consent. This one, I am not talking about the disabled community that has sex and has great sex and are able to give and revoke consent. For this one, we're really talking about individuals that do not have that cognitive executive function, and developmentally, they might actually be a child. And again, they cannot give consent. So that's what we mean by the last one. Next slide. I'm not sure what's happening to my slides right now. Okay. So now I want to go into sexual coercion. And this is, again, thinking about consent and violence in some ways. And it was in one of the other slides, but sexual coercion is defined as any behavior intended to compel a partner to engage in unwanted sexual activity. This is really important. What's important is the unwanted sexual activity part. So here's some examples of what that can look like. If you don't, they'll get it somewhere else. At least he doesn't hit you. Well, you used to want it a lot more. Do it for the health of the relationship. I'll just schedule it so they don't complain and get abusive with me. So these are all different scenarios of people experiencing sexual coercion or doing sexual coercion. The thing is, the relationship with sex is really complicated for many individuals. So let's say you're in a married relationship. There might be a situation where you were having frequent sex, but over some time, if you've experienced some trauma in your reproductive organs, that might be a reason why you might not be wanting to have sex more often, or if at all. And if your partner is not having that conversation with you, or they did have that conversation and they're still saying things like, do it for the health of the relationship, that's sexual coercion, because you may not be wanting to have sex for your own reason. And that's important. It's not consent if you're pressured to say yes. It's also not consent if you're afraid to say no. This is really important. So the feeling of being pressured is integral in understanding what coercion is. Coercion is literally someone trying to either manipulate you or intimidate you, or try to make you understand why you have to say yes, even though you know deep down in your gut that's not what you want to do. Or on the flip side, you're actually afraid to say no, so you are just going to endure a lot of the sexual activity. And again, that's not consent. So for example, if you're counting the days between sexual encounters, knowing how long you can go before your partner complains or lashes out, that's not intimacy, that's coercion. And there's a big difference between those two. Initiating sex does not mean that you need to do sexual coercion. And what does this mean? We need to understand two different types of desires. Responsive desire, which is when your sexual interest is a response to the stimulation of the body, and spontaneous desire, which is when you are sexually interested mentally before any physical contact is made. I think it's in the next slide. Let me make sure. But there was something called I went back. Yep, arousal non-concordance. So this is going to be related to the responsive desire, in that just because someone initiated sex with you, and let's say you didn't say yes or no, but you know you don't want to have sex, oftentimes our body is responding to stimulation. So it can respond to stimulation with an erection or vaginal lubrication, which in many instances, when it's a healthy scenario, that's a sign of arousal. However, if you are not wanting to be a part of a sexual activity or sexual encounter, and someone is initiating sex and your body is responding in what seems like arousal state, that's called arousal non-concordance. You will get aroused, but mentally and emotionally and physically, you don't want it. And that's where that spontaneous desire is important. If you are sexually interested mentally and your body is responding to that arousal, then yes, you are experiencing sex because you want to. But if someone is initiating sex when you don't want to have sex, and your body is, again, responding, and it's responding in a way that would indicate arousal, that's not sex. You are being coerced. You are actually experiencing a form of sexual violence, and that is a violation of your right and your body. So these involuntary physical responses are not equivalent to consent. Some other ways of looking at consent. I love the spectrum. This is by Kai-Cheng Tome, and it's inspired by the work of Betty Martin, Dr. Betty Martin, who we're going to go into her work a little bit later when we're thinking about consent as a personal skill. But we should start looking at consent in these ways. We have, it's almost like the phasings of a moon. We have enduring, we have tolerating, we have willing, and then we have wanting. What I really want to say about this is that when we're thinking about consent as a personal skill, we need to always bring in power dynamics. So this image is really, again, not exclusive to sex, but it can be applied to many forms of interpersonal interactions. What I want to really stress about here is the examples that they're giving under each of these phases of the moon. So for enduring, this is really much related to the violence piece, where people might be experiencing harm. But enduring is saying something like, this is hurting me, but I don't feel able to say no. The tolerating, we're slowly moving away from the harm, but it's still harmful. This is something I'm putting up with. Again, we'll probably be seeing a lot of sexual coercion here. And then willing. This is something I'm okay or neutral with or about. Sometimes we have partners that, we are with partners and there might be a situation where maybe we might not want to do something, but it's okay if we do it anyways, because we know that ultimately it doesn't take away or harm you in any way. And maybe your partner is going to enjoy it. But again, it's not necessarily about the partner. It's just that you are, again, neutral and you'll experience going to a party or experience a sexual encounter with the person. Again, you're neutral. And then the last one is wanting. This is what makes you feel good. This is what makes both people or multiple people feel good, because there's consent, there's communication. Many times in the enduring and tolerating, there's not a lot of communication happening, or if at all. And if the communication is happening, it can possibly sound like that sexual coercion and manipulation and threat. The willing and wanting, or rather the willing, is where, you could be giving a lot of communication or not, but eventually that communication happens. And then wanting, there's a lot of communication, or if you know your person very well, for example, engaging and understanding body expressions, facial expressions, all of that, you'll sense that someone is feeling good or that you're feeling good. Another spectrum. As you can tell, I love spectrums when it comes to consent, but I think for me, it's really important because it's helping me understand that it's so dynamic and it's not black and white. It's not this binary. Consent is not as easy, again, as just saying yes or no. And I gave a lot of examples. And so here's some more. Yes to no spectrum. In the beginning, if we are thinking about yes, we can slowly see ourselves going to no, and we can see certain things happening here. We have curiosity. We have learning something new. We have a challenge and risk. We could be uncomfortable. However, we have to have that communication with someone. So we're asking ourselves things like, what would that feel like to me? So if we're thinking about a sexual interaction or intimate interaction, it's exploring a new position, a new activity. You could be uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean you want to say no. Then we hit the maybe. In the maybe zone, we don't know which way we're going to fall. Are we going to fall on the yes side? Or are we going to fall on the no side? If we're falling on the no side, this is where things get unsafe. So deferring to someone else's judgment. We're constantly in this state of should I do this? Should they do that? Should I leave? Should I stay? We are experiencing backtracking, explaining, and justifying. We're saying things like, if I do or if I don't, then what will they think of me is a common question. So in the no part of the spectrum, we're doing a lot of thinking that is us feeling more than just uncomfortable. It's us feeling really unsafe and feeling like if I don't do a certain thing, then I might actually experience harm. But then if I do that very thing, I'm still experiencing harm. So what do I do? So it's really important for us to also understand that even within the no, that there's that spectrum of what that no can look like and what we're experiencing. And then on the yes side of the spectrum, again, there's so many things that can happen that isn't just a solid yes. We're experiencing a lot of different things and a lot of different dynamics and questions. This amazing spectrum is by Consent Wizardry, which provides a lot of consent workshops and trainings. And then non-consensual service. And so what does consent look like when it has nothing to do with intimacy? And so this one, a great example is maybe at work. So how are we experiencing consent or not experiencing consent at work? So for example, unsolicited advice. This doesn't have to even be in a work example scenario. It could even be amongst friends, amongst family members. How many times have you gotten unsolicited advice from, like, I'll talk about myself. I've gotten so much unsolicited advice from my uncles and aunts where I'm like, I never asked for this. Okay. Another thing is everything I do is for you. I've heard this a lot with caregivers. I know my parents have said that to me, to do something for them. And again, that's not consent. That's a form of like manipulation. Another one is helping how I want help versus how they want help. So this we can see a lot more in a work context. So without really understanding what your colleague, or if you're a supervisor, understanding your supervisee, just the ways in which we're supporting people. Another one is helping without permission. This can happen also not just at work, but also amongst your friends, amongst your parents, amongst your caregivers, amongst siblings. Essentially, any type of relationship is the helping without permission. The not taking no for an answer. This is also, again, it does not have to be a sexual intimacy situation, but any scenario. I know, for example, if I go to a certain friend's parents' home, they won't take no for an answer, especially if I've eaten a good amount of food and they're like, no, you have to eat food or else it's disrespectful. We're not going to take no as an answer. That's experiencing a level of a violation of consent, because if I'm saying no, but they're not receiving the no, you know what I mean? And then we have you need me. I've heard this a lot, especially amongst caregivers, or even just in like relationships, again, where it's not about the sex or the intimacy or the physical intimacy, but rather in order for you to, for example, live in this country, you need me because you're undocumented. You need me in terms of even amongst colleagues, like you're not going to be able to get this promotion because you need me. So I need to do XYZ things on this work project. I need to be the lead. You need me more than I need you. So again, very, very conspicuous ways of engaging with consent. And then we have whatever type of splaining, mansplaining, cisgender splaining, white splaining, I don't know, what some splainings, and basically just again, someone explaining something to you, especially if that's not their expertise or background, and really telling you what about the things and experiences that are true and authentic to you. So now we begin with the idea of consent as a personal skill. So Dr. Betty Martin actually created the Wheel of Consent. This is what you see here. This is what she created. I'm going to have some more slides that break this down and make it a little bit more readable. But essentially, what I wanted to share about this is that Dr. Martin's Wheel of Consent is a model of relating, which brings clarity and greater authenticity to all areas of life when it comes to consent. So this can mean, your work with your colleagues, with friends and family, and our most intimate relationships. It distinguishes between the doing aspect of an interaction. So for example, who is doing? And the gift aspect, and I'm putting gift in quotes because I'm going to use a different term later, but who is it for? When we're asking these two questions, who is doing and who is it for, this creates 4 possible dynamics, which you see here. Again, I will go into this in a little bit. Each of which have different flavor and requires a different type of consent agreement to be made. This is the central idea of the Wheel of Consent, in terms of from like basically what are the consequences, what is the flow of communication, and how are we engaging with one another? Okay. So again, in a more simple visual, we have the who is doing versus who is it for. So I'm naming it as I am doing, and I'm naming it as for you for the purpose of explaining. The person doing isn't necessarily always doing it for the other person. Sometimes it's for them. And if we take a larger look at this, this can actually be harmful if consent is not given or expressed. Who is it for? The other question. That's not just what's being done. It's looking at consent as a way to create the dynamic and environment of safety and security. To help clarify the 4 dynamics or quadrants, this is what we've created. So by these 2 questions, you can look at this simplified diagram. The vertical axis, which is the green text, shows you who is doing. So either I am doing or you are doing. The horizontal axis, which is in yellow text, shows who it's for. So either it's for me or it's for you. Notice that the 4 quadrants consist of 2 matching pairs. So if I am in the giving quadrant, then you are in the receiving quadrant, and vice versa. So meanwhile, if you're taking, then I am allowing. Let's go a little bit more. So now here are the 4 quadrants and based on the exchange of touch. So the example I'm going to use is touch. It's possible, again, to create a diagram that doesn't have touch as an example, but in order to hone in the point and drive this home. So each quadrant can be named according to which consensual activity it is describing. So for example, if we are going in the giving quadrant, which is right up here on the top left, I touch you the way that I want. So I am giving. I am touching you. So I'm doing it for you. The next quadrant over, we have the taking. So I touch you the way I want. So I'm doing it for me. Then we go to the receiving part of the quadrant. You touch me the way I want. So it's for me, but it's being done by you. And then we have our last quadrant, which is you touch me the way you want. So you are doing it for you. So there's this idea of want to versus willing to. And a question people often ask about the wheel of consent is, but if we are having sex, shouldn't it be for both of us? Why would it be for only one person? And you're right. It shouldn't just be for one person, because if it's just for one person, the other person is going to be experiencing harm, and that's not what we're talking about. When consent is present, this is what we mean. It's important that if 2 people are sharing physical intimacy, it should be for both of them. So for example, it is something they both really want to do. We can illustrate this as follows with an example. So let me see if it's in the next slide. So here are the questions that may arise. So we have in the giving quadrant, would you like me to touch you? It's for you. In the second quadrant, the taking one, may I touch you? That's for me, because I'm doing it for me. The third quadrant, will you touch me? This is the receiving. It's also for me. Will you touch me? And then the last quadrant, would you like to touch me? It's for you. It's the allowing. So think about how each of these questions are phrased and sit with them for a little bit in terms of who's doing it for who, right? There are some questions that might originate from any of these quadrants. So for example, can we try something new? Or can we stop now? These 4 quadrant names, giving, taking, receiving, and allowing, can be applied to non-touch interactions as well as touch-based ones. For example, if we want to do the non-touch examples, you could give me a massage, or you could give me a birthday present, or you could give me some advice. Notice that I may or may not have asked you for the advice if we're thinking about the advice one. And in that last case, we would not have made an agreement and would therefore be outside the wheel of consent. So again, when we're thinking about consent, we're not just thinking of, the touch, but we're thinking about the giving, taking, receiving, allowing idea. So now what happens when consent is not present? The dynamics for what we have when we have full consent of both people is the awareness, again, of both who is doing and who it's for. But the wheel of consent can describe what happens in these same dynamics without consent. So this is where I'll get into it. So in the first quadrant, if somebody gives without agreement, they may be people pleasing or giving to get. In the second quadrant, if somebody takes without agreement, they may be stealing or perpetrating. In the third quadrant, if someone is receiving without agreement, they may be entitled or exploiting. And if somebody allows without agreement, they may be enduring or a victim. So notice how in this second quadrant and third and fourth quadrant, we can see that dynamic specifically around gender-based violence or sexual violence. We have a perpetrator and we have a victim. And so this is really important, is when you become familiar with the non-consensual shadows of the wheel, you might start to notice which ones you sometimes find yourself in, especially when there is no consent present, or you're not getting it, or you're not giving it. The self-awareness can be helpful because once you've noticed it, the way to get out of the shadows is to establish clear agreements based on asking who is doing, and again, who is it for, and have we both consented to that. This wheel cannot work if only one person is participating in the wheel. So just wanted to be clear about that. It's also helpful to remember that the shadows are adaptive survival mechanisms, which all of us have used to try and get our needs met. So I'm not saying that I've never participated in this without consent. I'm saying I have possibly been, not possibly, I've definitely been in some of these quadrants, especially when I wasn't thinking about consent in a more expansive way. So the wheel of consent offers the tool for meeting these needs in a more skillful and consensual way. And that's essentially what the wheel of consent is us really thinking about, again, how do we understand the spectrum of consent, and how do we build in that personal skill of how do we ask for it? So first of all, who's doing and who is it for? And I know that I had mentioned this earlier and I showed this slide earlier. So now to go into some examples. And again, we would have been interacting, but now this is a recorded session, so I will interact with myself and hopefully it can provide some insight. But here is one example. I ask my partner if I can place my hand on their knee, and they reply, sure, that's fine. This sounds like there's consent, an affirmative, authentic agreement, right? But let's look at the wheel of consent and see where this is incomplete, because again, we need to answer who is it for. So who is it for? And there's so many different variations of touch for me and touch for them. So I'll go through each one. So if touch is for me, this could be one scenario for who is it for. Maybe I'm feeling anxious and I need physical contact with somebody and they happen to be nearby. Another scenario for when touch is for me, for that example. Maybe I'm curious about their pants they're wearing and I want to feel the texture of the fabric. Another scenario for touches for me is maybe I'm attracted to them and would enjoy touching their leg for that very reason. When touches for them, it could be that maybe I sense that they are upset and need some physical reassurance, but I know they have difficulty asking for that themselves, so I initiate the offer. And then another scenario where a touch could be for them is maybe they have told me about the pain in their knee and I'm medically trained, so I offer to put my hand on their knee to see if I can find out what the problem is. So within that example of the touch of someone's knee, you can already see here the who is doing, which is me. I'm the one doing the touching, but we need to answer the question of who it's for. So we can consider the quadrants of giving, taking, receiving, and allowing. So a non-touch example. I asked my sister to come with me to a friend's party, and my sister replies, yes, I will. But let's consider who is it for, because we know what the doing is. The doing is me asking my sister to come to a party. So when it's for me, this could be a scenario. I really want to go to the party, but someone I don't like will be there, which I feel anxious about. And I'm hoping my sister is willing to come along with me for moral support. And if it's for her, I'm not bothered about the party, but I know that someone my sister is really interested to meet will be there, so I suggest we go together. If it's for neither of us, which could also be an option, I'm not bothered about the party, but I'm assuming my sister really wants to go, but my sister is also not bothered about the party either, but assumes I really want to go. And when it's for both, which also is another scenario and possibility, it's a party that I think we'll both enjoy, and it'll be even more fun for both of us to go together. So again, if we're thinking about who is doing and who is it for, the who is it for can take so many different iterations. And it's just so important to consider this, because it can really, again, tell us what is going on. So it would be your turn. We would play the 3-minute game, but we're not doing that. So I'm going to dive into talking about our RIDHA framework, which is the last thing that I'm going to get into. And basically, this RIDHA framework is our best effort to create a user-friendly roadmap to building and sustaining a healthy, intimate relationship. Cultivating such a relationship is not an easy task, as you can tell from just this concept of consent and thinking about it as a personal skill. it can get complicated, which is also why there's so much perpetrating and so much violence happening, specifically when we're thinking about gender-based violence or intimate partner relations or just intimate relations. And so, again, one thing we want to stress is that we're not mind readers, and the people you're engaging with, interacting with, are also not mind readers. So there has to be clear and direct conversations, not only around each other's expectations, but also interests and experiences. Also, a healthy relationship requires both individuals to become comfortable with vulnerability and sharing any parts of themselves that might be wounded. So how well we get to know our partner depends on how much we are willing to invest in knowing all the parts of them, as well as sharing all the parts of ourselves. So we've created the RIDHA framework, and I'm basically explaining a little bit about like what the core is of RIDHA. Again, we love acronyms at this org. So RIDHA does stand, it's an acronym that stands for our process of understanding what a healthy relationship can look like. So basically, I don't want to say a checklist, but like a great tool to understand where we're at with each other. When we're keeping all this in mind, we have to prioritize the following important components of a healthy relationship. So things like compassion and pleasure, non-judgmental and direct communication, individual awareness and a commitment to sharing power, consent, boundaries, and safety, and trust and commitment. So before I dive into the acronym itself, I wanted to kind of go over why we chose RIDHA. There's this incredible story that I didn't find, but we partnered with Karama, who is this incredible organization in DC, and Karama wrote this paper where we asked them to research the specific hadith about angels cursing the wife if she refused to have sex with her husband. They produced this brilliant paper where they debunked that hadith, and one of the stories that they tell is this one. And hadith is the saying of the prophet, peace be upon him. And so the story goes, the prophet, peace be upon him, married Safiya, may God be pleased with her. And he approached her and essentially, wanted to engage with her in sex, but she actually declined. And this was related to the wedding night. So she declined that she didn't want to engage in sex. The prophet actually did not force himself on her. He also didn't admonish her. He didn't question her about the refusal. And what's interesting is that he also didn't use that hadith or the sayings of that hadith, or he didn't basically tell her that the angels were going to curse her. Instead, he just kind of left her alone. He treated her with respect, gentleness, affection. He was super courteous. And in reality, this is kind of the essence of RIDHA that we wanted to embody, is this idea of how the prophet is setting the precedent of a marital, in this situation, right? A marital sexual relationship that honors the very core Islamic concept of RIDHA, or fullness of choice. Safiya has the fullness of choice to say yes or no to engaging in sex. And it's very, very disappointing to see the ways in which the different stories that we have of the prophet or during the prophet's time, or different verses of the Quran, which is the holy book of Muslims, that are used to talk about things like beating your spouse, or primarily your wife, your female spouse, if they do not have sex with you. And again, this paper debunks all of that. So we wanted to use RIDHA as a way to really be grounded in this idea of, well, what is consent? What is fullness of choice? I think fullness of choice goes even beyond just consent itself. So really using this story as a way to guide us in what is a healthy relationship, or how do we understand that? So again, the meaning of RIDHA that we found is to be satisfied, to be content, to consent or to agree, to approve, to accept, sanction, to be pleased, to wish and desire, and to permit. All right, now let's go into the acronym. If my slides will go. No, okay. So RIDHA, if you break it down, R stands for rooted in compassion and mutual pleasure. I is informed by communication and knowledge. D is driven by equity and fairness. H is housed in safety and security. A is affirmed in commitment and fidelity. For R also stands for rahma, which is the Arabic word for compassion. In this one, the Quran speaks of how God has created people in pairs, putting love and compassion between them so that they may find tranquility in each other. So we really took that essence and said, what does it mean for a relationship to be rooted in compassion and mutual pleasure? So we have in the book, this is actually taken from our sex talk book that was just published last summer. But on the left side, you have green flags, and on the right side, you have red flags. A green flag, in terms of how you can witness compassion and mutual pleasure, is two people or the couple or whomever you're engaging with takes interest in what pleases you and what does not, and actively seeks out ways for you to feel sexual pleasure, for example. Or it doesn't have to be sexual pleasure. It's a commitment to helping you orgasm and reach sexual climax, or is committed to helping you orgasm and reach sexual climax, is understanding and kind when you don't feel like having sex. So all of these are examples of sex and sexual intimacy. However, you can even spin it where, what does it mean to take interest in what your sibling likes? Are you committed to ensuring that they find pleasure in life and in the things that they do because you're supporting them in, for example, their career choices, or you're supporting them in the partner that they are choosing for themselves? How do we embody compassion and understanding of the people in our lives in that way? If we look at the red flags for rooted in compassion and mutual pleasure, again, a lot of this is centered around sex, and I will try to give you the other side, or like the non-sexual examples. But a couple are: demand sex when they feel like it and irrespective of your needs and desires, insist you participate in sexual activity that makes you feel uncomfortable and or unsafe, gets angry and makes you feel guilty if you decline sex, and is having sex outside of your relationship without knowledge and or agreement. Non-sexual things are completely dismissing you and not engaging in what it is that you desire. Again, it doesn't have to be related to sex. So those are some red flags and green flags for R. Next, we have informed by communication and knowledge. The Arabic word for knowledge is actually ilm, so that's also what we have there. But open, honest dialogue and seeking knowledge is a key between partners to uphold informed consent, build trust, and facilitate ongoing connection. So some of the green flags that we've identified here is both have the ability to process issues together as they come up. You're able to share and discuss feelings without fear of being judged or facing consequences. You're able to communicate a boundary around sex or even non-sexual things without feeling ashamed or fear of being judged. Again, the green flags don't have to be in an intimate partner relationship. This can be amongst colleagues. So for example, being able to communicate a boundary around how to do a particular project or task without the fear of being judged by your colleague. So that's one example. Some red flags: irrational irritability leading to physical or emotional threats. They're temperamental communication. There is emotional blackmailing, physical confrontation of any sort, and silent treatments. D, driven by equity and fairness. Fairness, the Arabic term is adala. So all people are created equal and have integrity before God. A relationship which reflects this equality and shared power and privilege by both partners will help create a healthy partnership rooted in fairness. So some green flags for this is both take responsibility for when they are wrong and apologize. Both treat each other as an equal partner, not as someone over whom they have power over and authority over. Both are transparent about individual and shared finances, especially about how they've spent. Both share power, especially during conflict, and work together towards finding solutions. Those green flags, again, those are all things that must exist in a friendship, in a co-worker, like in a relationship amongst co-workers or supervisors, caregivers. Some red flags: the partner isolates you away from your friends and family. Your partner controls all aspects of your finances or just your entire life. Your partner makes your medical decisions for you. Your partner makes all or most life decisions. This is, again, specific to intimate partner relationship. And as you can tell from these red flags, or maybe you can't tell, but these red flags are key indicators of when an individual is actually in a domestic violence relationship or an intimate partner relationship, intimate partner violence relationship. Excuse me. H, Housed in safety and security. So the Arabic term herma roughly translate to security, but more so, I don't know how to say the word, but it's I'm not going to try to say the word. So here are some green flags. If there is conflict or harm, there is an apology and intentional change in behavior instead of a repeated pattern of harmful, aggressive, or violent behavior. You feel like you're in control when it comes to making decisions about your body. Sex is not used as a weapon. Religious scripture or tradition is not used to denigrate or shame you or coerce you into any particular behavior. Again, if we were to think about safety and security in, let's say, your relationship with your supervisor or your boss, it's feeling like you have control over your projects and the decisions you make about those projects, where you don't fear your supervisor. It's you being able to have conflict with maybe a friend and being able to exchange an apology and really change your behavior towards one another without getting volatile, upset, and aggressive with them and taking things very personally. So some red flags: constantly puts you down, shames you, or blames you, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, or even physically harms you, but denies it. You are afraid of ending a relationship with your partner because you fear them hurting you, themselves, or how they might react or respond. Again, the red flags for HERMA are also very much indicative of a domestic violence, sexual violence, intimate partner violence situation. A, which is affirmed in commitment and fidelity. Commitment, the Arabic word for commitment is aqd. Sexual intimacy in Islam is preceded by a clear agreement between the partners, thus affirming their commitment to each other and honoring the reality of sex as a sacred, spiritual, and mutually beneficial experience. You need to know that when you're in a healthy relationship or you're engaging in a relationship that's more intimate, you want to get a good understanding of the commitment that you have with one another. But let's say this is not even about an intimate partner relationship, but rather a friendship. You still want to know what your commitment is to that person. And fidelity does not necessarily need to be in the sense of that intimate relationship, but you can even think of it as loyalty. What is your loyalty to your friendships? What are your loyalties to your job? What are your loyalties to your siblings? If you're the caregiver, what are your loyalties to the people you're caregiving? So some green flags: both respect each other and each other's religious, spiritual boundaries and commitments. When one partner wants to reevaluate the relationship structure, there is direct and clear communication instead of secrecy and silence. Both have clear understandings of the purpose of a relationship and are aligned on the commitments. Both honor relationship agreements, marital vows, or contractual agreements. Some red flags are, so when you're in a deceptive secret relationship, here are some red flags. The partner avoids any conversations about public commitment. A partner is resistant to introducing you to their family, friends, and other social circles without any reason. A partner has asked you to keep your relationship a secret indefinitely. Some red flags when your partner is having a deceptive secret relationship with someone else. Doesn't seem interested in you and blames you for their disinterest. Partner seems emotionally absent. They're secretive about their finances or whereabouts and gets angry when you ask questions. So here's some questions for you to think about as you reflect on the acronym itself and also just as the acronym as a whole. Have you ever experienced RIDHA in your life? How about in your relationships? And again, the relationships don't have to specifically be romantic. They can be platonic, they can be familial, they can be professional. And then also, have you experienced RIDHA in your communities? I end with these questions because the last objective was to think about consent as a community culture. And we truly believe that if you think about the RIDHA framework that I just shared, that is a part of that community change that we're looking for. That is the part of that cultural shift that we're looking for, is how are we embodying and understanding a healthy relationship? How are we embodying and grounding ourselves in the interactions that we have with one another, whether it's on that macro level, or if we're thinking meso level, which is the community level, and then that micro level. So these are all very important and go hand in hand with consent, because you can't have healthy relationships with people if you're not thinking about consent and how to ask for consent or how to give consent or how to understand consent. So having this personal skill and knowing how to do it and say it is very, very key. And then this is where I ask for questions, which of course there's going to be several. I wish I could interact with you guys in person, but hopefully next time when the opportunity arises, it would be such a pleasure. But that is all from me. I so appreciate and having this opportunity to be able to talk about consent and introducing our RIDHA framework. If you need to get in touch, you can email me, or you can go to our website, or you can follow us on our socials, which is very well curated by our youth coordinator and our social media comms communications coordinator. So it's been such a pleasure. I hope to see you all soon. Take care.